If I had waited one more second, he would have been dead, and I would have been just another waitress clearing tables like nothing ever happened. But that night something felt wrong before anything actually was. The kind of wrong you don't see, you feel. Like a chill sliding under your skin while the restaurant buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses and overpriced wine being poured like it meant something. And I kept telling myself I was just tired, 12-hour shift, feet aching, mind drifting, until I heard it, faint, almost hidden beneath the noise. A soft rhythmic beep that didn't belong, not in a place like this where everything was polished and controlled. And that's when I noticed the coat, draped too carefully over the back of a chair, untouched, while its owner laughed too loud, too forced, like he was trying to convince himself he belonged there. And my heart started racing for no reason I could explain, just instinct, raw and loud, telling me something was off, something was about to go very wrong. And then the door opened, and the entire room shifted without anyone saying a word. Because he walked in, Alexander Hayes, a man I'd never met but somehow recognized instantly. The kind of presence that made people straighten their posture and lower their voices without knowing why, like gravity had changed direction just for him. And he didn't look around like he needed to understand the room. He already owned it, his dark suit perfect, his movements calm, controlled. Like nothing in the world could surprise him, and for a second I forgot everything else, until the sound came again. Beep, beep. Closer now, sharper, cutting through the noise like it was meant only for me. And I looked back at that coat, and my stomach dropped because I knew. Not how, not why, just knew. And before I could think, before fear could catch up with me, my body moved, tray hitting the counter behind me as I stepped forward, weaving through tables. Ignoring the looks, ignoring the voice in my head telling me this was insane. Because he was already walking past me, already moving deeper into the room. And if I didn't act right then, right in that exact second, something irreversible would happen. So I reached out, fingers wrapping around his sleeve, and everything stopped. Conversations, music, even my own breath, as his eyes dropped to mine, sharp, unreadable, dangerous in a way that made my chest tighten. And his security was already moving, hands ready, tension snapping into place like a loaded spring. But I didn't let go, couldn't let go, not when that sound was still ticking in my ears, louder now, faster, like a countdown I couldn't see. And I pulled, harder than I thought I could, dragging him toward the kitchen doors, not explaining, not asking, just acting. Because something inside me knew that if I didn't move him, if I didn't get him out of that room, everything would change in a way none of us could take back. And just as the doors swung shut behind us, the world outside shattered into a single, deafening moment that proved I had been right. And for the first time, the man who controlled everything looked at me like I had just rewritten his fate. The air inside the kitchen did not move for a full second after the blast, like the world itself had paused to decide what came next. And I realized I was still holding onto his sleeve, my fingers locked in place, as if letting go would somehow undo everything that had just happened. My ears ringing softly while distant alarms began to echo through the building, sharp and disorienting. And when I finally looked up at him, really looked, I expected anger, confusion, maybe even cold dismissal, but what I saw instead was something far more dangerous. Something quiet and calculating, like he was rearranging the entire situation in his mind and placing me at the center of it. "Explain," he said, his voice low but steady. Not raised, not panicked, just controlled in a way that made my pulse jump. And I opened my mouth, but nothing came out at first, because how do you explain a feeling? How do you justify dragging a man like him away from a room full of people based on a sound no one else seemed to notice? There was a noise. I managed, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be, a beeping. It did not belong. And for a second I thought he would dismiss it, call it coincidence. But his eyes did not leave mine, searching, measuring, like he was trying to decide if I was reckless or something else entirely. And behind him the kitchen doors burst open as his security moved in, fast and precise. Their presence filling the space with a different kind of pressure, one that had nothing to do with the explosion outside and everything to do with him. "Sir, we need to move," one of them said, urgent but controlled. And I felt the shift immediately, the invisible line between my world and his snapping into place, because whatever just happened out there was not random, not to them. not to him. And before I could step back, before I could remind myself that I was just a waitress who should go back to work and pretend none of this existed, his hand closed around my wrist, firm but not painful, anchoring me in place. "She comes with us," he said, not even glancing at his men. Like it was already decided, like I was no longer a question but an answer. And my heart stumbled over itself as I shook my head instinctively. "No, I cannot. I have a shift. I need to stay." The words sounded small the moment they left my mouth, swallowed by the reality pressing in around me. Because the kitchen no longer felt like a place where food was made. It felt like a threshold. And I had already crossed it without realizing. His grip did not tighten, but it did not loosen either. And when he leaned slightly closer, his voice dropped just enough that only I could hear it. "You heard something no one else did." And seconds later the world outside changed. "That makes you important." The way he said important did not feel like a compliment. It felt like a decision. Like I had been moved onto a different board without being asked. And I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, trying to hold on to something normal. Anything normal. But the alarms grew louder, footsteps rushed past in the hallway, voices overlapping in confusion and fear. And I knew there was no going back to refilling glasses and wiping tables like nothing had happened. Not after this, not after him. "I did not mean to get involved," I said, barely above a whisper. And for the first time his expression shifted, just slightly, not softer, not kinder, but more focused, like I had confirmed something he already suspected. "No one ever does," he replied. And then he let go of my wrist, only to guide me forward with a subtle motion that felt less like a suggestion, and more like gravity pulling me in a direction I could not resist. His men forming around us as we moved. The kitchen doors opening again to a hallway filled with flashing lights and distant chaos. And as we stepped into it, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. I had not just saved his life, I had just stepped into it. And there was no version of this where he would let me walk away like I had never existed. The hallway felt colder than it should have, the kind of cold that did not come from temperature, but from the way everything suddenly became precise, controlled. Like every step we took had already been planned long before I ever heard that sound. And I stayed close without meaning to. Not because I trusted him, but because the moment I tried to slow down, one of the men behind us adjusted his position just enough to remind me that leaving was no longer an option. And Alexander did not look back to check if I was following. He already knew I would be, his pace steady, unhurried. As if chaos had nothing to do with him, even while flashing lights painted the walls in red and white pulses, and people rushed past in the opposite direction. Voices overlapping in confusion. But no one stopped him. No one questioned him. They moved out of his way like it was instinct. Like something in them recognized what I had only started to understand, that he did not belong to places like this. He owned the outcome of them. And when we reached the service exit, the door was already open, a black SUV waiting outside with its engine running. The night air sharp against my skin as I stepped out and hesitated for half a second, just enough to feel the weight of everything I was leaving behind. The job, the normal life. The version of myself that would have gone home after a long shift and complained about sore feet, instead of stepping into a situation that made no sense. "Get in," he said, not harsh, not loud, just certain. And I realized then that he had not once asked me what I wanted. Not because he did not care, but because in his world, wanting did not change anything, decisions did. And he had already made his. So I slid into the back seat, the door closing behind me with a soft, final sound that felt louder than anything else that night. And within seconds the car was moving, smooth and fast, the city lights stretching into blurred lines outside the window, while my reflection stared back at me, pale, eyes wide, trying to catch up to a reality that had shifted too quickly to process. And he sat across from me, not speaking, not checking his phone, just watching. His gaze steady in a way that made it impossible to look away for long, like silence itself had become a conversation. And I could feel the questions building in my chest, pressing up against my ribs until I could not hold them back anymore. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. And he did not answer immediately, his eyes flicking briefly to the window before returning to me, measuring again, always measuring. "Somewhere safe," he said finally. And something about the way he said safe made me realize it did not mean what I thought it did. Because safe for him was not the same as safe for me. And the car turned sharply, leaving the main road behind as the buildings grew quieter, larger, more distant from the noise of the city. And I felt it again, that same instinct from earlier, the one that had pulled me toward him before everything changed. Only now it was different, heavier. Like it was trying to warn me that whatever came next was not something I could simply walk away from. "You think this was random?" I said before I could stop myself, the words slipping out as I replayed the sound in my head, the timing, the way it all lined up too perfectly to be an accident. And for the first time since we left, something in his expression shifted, not surprise, not exactly, but recognition. Like I had just stepped closer to a truth he had not offered yet. "No," he said quietly. And the single word settled between us with more weight than any explanation could have carried. And I felt my stomach tighten, because if it was not random, then it was meant. And if it was meant, then me pulling him away had changed something far bigger than I understood. And he leaned back slightly, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "Which means someone expected me to be there," he continued. And his eyes locked onto mine again, sharper this time, like the space between us had narrowed into something dangerous and unavoidable. "And you," he added after a brief pause, "were not part of that plan." And I should have felt relieved, should have felt like that meant I was free to leave once we reached wherever we were going. But the way he said it did not sound like release. It sounded like a problem, and problems, I was starting to understand, were things he did not ignore. They were things he solved. And the realization settled deep in my chest as the car slowed in front of a gated property, lights flickering on as we approached, revealing something far removed from the world I knew. And as the gates opened without hesitation, I understood something else just as clearly. I had not just stepped into his life. I had stepped into something that was already moving long before I arrived. And now that I was in it, there was no simple way out. The car came to a stop so smoothly, I almost did not realize we had arrived until the gates closed behind us with a quiet, deliberate click that echoed louder in my mind than the explosion ever had. And I sat there for a second longer than I should have, staring out at a place that did not look real. The kind of estate you only see in magazines or movies. Wide open space, clean lines, lights placed exactly where they needed to be, not too bright, not too dim. Everything controlled down to the smallest detail. And it hit me all at once that this was his world, not something he visited, not something he borrowed, but something built around him, for him. And I was sitting in the middle of it like I belonged there when I absolutely did not. "Out," one of the men said quietly, already stepping away from the car. And I hesitated again, not because I thought I could refuse, but because stepping out meant accepting that this was real, that the night was not going to reset itself. That I was not going to wake up in my small apartment with sore feet and a normal life waiting for me. But the door opened anyway, and cool night air slipped in, grounding me just enough to move. So I stepped out, my shoes feeling too loud against the smooth pavement as I followed them toward the entrance, and Alexander walked ahead without slowing. Like he expected the world to keep up with him, not the other way around. The front doors opening before he even reached them, someone inside already waiting, already prepared. And I realized then that nothing here was reactive. Everything was anticipatory, like this place existed 2 steps ahead of reality at all times. And the moment I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere changed again, quieter, heavier, like even sound knew it had to behave differently here. And I wrapped my arms around myself without meaning to, not from cold but from the weight of it all, the silence, the precision, the way every detail seemed intentional. And he finally stopped, turning just enough to face me fully for the first time since we left the car. His gaze settling on me with that same steady intensity that made it hard to breathe normally. "You are safe here," he said. And I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because it felt so far from the truth I knew. "Safe does not feel like this," I replied before I could stop myself. And for a second I thought I had crossed a line, that I had said something I should not have. But instead of reacting, he studied me again. Like I had just confirmed something he had been testing. "That is because you are measuring it against the wrong world," he said, calm, certain. And I felt the shift in that statement, subtle but undeniable, like he was not just talking about the building around us, he was talking about everything. About the difference between where I came from and where I was now, and how those rules did not apply the same way here. And I took a breath, forcing myself to stay grounded, to not let his words pull me deeper than I already was. Then let me go back to the right one, I said, holding his gaze this time, refusing to look away even though every instinct told me to. And for a moment the room felt smaller, tighter, like something invisible had drawn a line between us that neither of us was stepping away from. And then he moved, not toward me, not away, just enough to shift the balance of the space, his voice lowering slightly, not threatening, but final. You heard something no one else did, and you acted without hesitation, he said, each word measured, deliberate. That makes you either very lucky or very dangerous. And I felt my chest tighten at that. Because I had never been either of those things before, I had just been normal, invisible in the best way. The kind of person who blended into the background, who lived a life that did not attract attention. And now I was standing here being evaluated like I was something else entirely, something I did not recognize. I am neither, I said quietly. And for the first time there was the faintest hint of something different in his expression, not disbelief, not quite, but interest, like the answer itself had value. We will see, he replied. And before I could respond, before I could push back or ask the questions building in my mind, he turned away, already moving toward the staircase. Already continuing a conversation that I was not fully part of yet somehow completely involved in. And I stood there for a second longer, the weight of everything settling in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Because deep down I understood something I did not want to admit. I had not just entered his world by accident. I had triggered something inside it. And whatever came next was not going to be something I could predict or control. I did not follow him right away. Not because I thought I had a choice, but because something inside me needed a second to catch up. To understand how I had gone from balancing trays under dim restaurant lights to standing in a place where every step felt like it carried weight. Like the air itself was watching. And I realized no one was telling me what to do anymore, which somehow felt more unsettling than being ordered around. Because it meant they expected me to figure it out, to move correctly without being guided. And that kind of expectation did not belong in my world. But it did here. So I took a breath and followed, my footsteps quieter this time, more careful, as if I had already started adjusting without realizing it. And the staircase curved upward in a way that felt intentional, not just architecture, but design meant to control how you moved, how you saw. And when I reached the top, I found him already there, not waiting, just present, standing near a wide window that overlooked the grounds. The city lights far enough away to feel like a different reality, and for a moment he did not turn, like he already knew I had arrived. Like everything about me had already been accounted for. You are thinking about leaving, he said without looking at me. And it was not a question, it was an observation, one that landed too accurately to ignore. And I crossed my arms again, more out of instinct than defiance. I am thinking about what happens next, I replied. And this time he did turn, slowly, his gaze settling on me with that same steady intensity that made it impossible to hide anything. Even the thoughts I had not fully formed yet. What happens next depends on whether tonight was luck or intention, he said. And I felt that word again, intention, echoing in my mind like something heavier than it should be. Because I had not intended anything. I had reacted, moved without thinking, and yet here I was being measured like it had been a choice. Like it had revealed something about me that I did not understand. It was just instinct, I said, quieter now. Because saying it out loud made it sound smaller than it felt. And for a brief second his expression shifted again, not dismissive, not convinced, just interested, like instinct itself was something worth examining. Instinct is rarely just anything, he replied, stepping closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough to change the way the room felt, like the distance between us carried meaning. And I held my ground. Even though every part of me was aware of how different we were, how easily he moved through this world compared to how out of place I felt in it. Then what do you think it is? I asked, surprising myself with the question, because part of me did not want to know the answer. And he studied me for a moment longer before speaking, his voice lower now, more deliberate. Either you notice things others ignore, or you are connected to something you have not seen yet. And I felt my breath catch slightly at that. Not because I believed it, but because of the way he said it, like both options led to the same place, a place I was already standing in whether I understood it or not. And I shook my head lightly, trying to ground myself again. I am just a waitress, I said. The words feeling almost fragile in this space, like they did not carry the same weight they used to. And for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something that almost resembled a reaction from him. Not amusement, not disbelief, but recognition of the difference between how I saw myself and how he saw the situation. You were, he said simply. And that single word landed heavier than anything else he had said so far. Because it was not a suggestion, it was a conclusion, one that did not ask for my agreement. And I felt something shift inside me at that, a realization I did not want to accept forming quietly beneath everything else, because if I was not that anymore, then what was I? And before I could push that thought further, he turned slightly, his attention shifting to something beyond me, something I could not see yet, and the atmosphere changed again. Subtle but immediate, like the room itself had adjusted to a new variable. Someone is already asking questions about tonight, he said, almost to himself. And my chest tightened at that, because I did not need him to explain what that meant. Not fully, just enough to understand that whatever had happened was not staying contained, that it was moving outward, spreading into places I had no control over. And his gaze returned to me, sharper now, more focused than before. Which means you do not get to disappear, he added. And there it was again, that quiet finality, the sense that something had already been decided before I even realized there was a decision to be made. And I felt the weight of it settle fully for the first time. Because this was no longer about one moment, one instinct, one reaction. It was about what came after. And I was already part of that whether I wanted to be or not. The silence after his words did not feel empty. It felt full, like something had been set in motion that neither of us could stop now. And I stood there trying to process what he meant, trying to hold on to the idea that I still had some control, that I could still decide how this ended. But the longer I stayed in that room, the more I realized that control here did not look like it did in my world. It was quieter, less visible, and far more absolute. I do not understand why that means I have to stay, I said finally, my voice steady even though my chest felt tight. And he did not respond right away, which somehow made it worse, because when he spoke, it always felt deliberate, like every word had already been weighed before it reached me. And he turned slightly toward the window again, his gaze drifting outward for just a second before returning. Because the people who plan tonight will not assume it failed, he said, calm, measured. They will assume something changed. And I felt that sentence settle in slowly, piece by piece, until it reached a point where I could not ignore what it implied. And that something is me, I said, quieter now. And he did not correct me, which was answer enough, and a part of me wanted to argue, to say that no one even knew who I was, that I had just been there, just another face in a crowded room. But deep down I knew that was not how this worked, because he had noticed me, and if he had noticed me, then someone else could too. I did not do anything, I said, even though the words felt weaker this time, like I was trying to convince myself more than him. And he stepped closer again, not threatening, not forceful, just enough to close the space between us in a way that made everything feel more real, more immediate. You changed the outcome, he replied, his voice lower now, more direct. That is always something. And I felt my breath catch slightly, because there it was again, that shift. The way he saw things in terms of cause and effect, action and consequence, while I was still trying to hold on to intention, onto the idea that what I had done did not define what came next, but in his world, it clearly did. And I looked away for a second, trying to gather my thoughts, trying to find a way to push back that did not sound naive. So what happens to me now? I asked, and the question hung there longer than I expected, stretching out in the silence until it felt heavier than it should have. And when I looked back at him, his expression had not changed, but something in his eyes had sharpened, like the question itself mattered more than the answer. That depends on whether you want to understand what you stepped into, he said. And I frowned slightly, not because I did not hear him, but because I did, too clearly. And it was not the answer I expected. You think I have a choice, I said. And for the first time, there was something close to a pause in his response, not hesitation, but acknowledgement, like he recognized the truth in that question. You have a decision, he corrected, and the distinction landed harder than I expected, because it meant I could choose how I faced this, even if I could not choose whether it existed. And I felt something shift inside me at that, small but real, like a part of me that had been reacting all night finally caught up enough to respond. "Then I want to understand," I said, the words coming out more certain than I felt. And his gaze held mine for a second longer before he nodded once. A small motion, but definitive, like something had just been confirmed. "Then you start by staying," he said. And there it was again, that same conclusion, the same direction everything seemed to lead to no matter how I tried to approach it. And I exhaled slowly, not in defeat, not entirely, but in acceptance of something I could not change in this moment. And as I stood there, looking at him, at the world he moved through so easily, I realized something that made everything feel different. This was no longer just about what happened tonight. It was about what it revealed, about the fact that I had seen something I was never supposed to see, heard something no one else did, and acted in a way that pulled me into a reality I did not belong to. And now that I was here, understanding it was not just an option, it was the only way forward, even if I did not yet know what it would cost. Staying sounded simple when he said it. Just one word, just one decision. But the moment it settled into the space between us, I felt the weight behind it, like it carried layers I had not uncovered yet. And I nodded slowly. Not because I fully understood what I was agreeing to, but because I knew refusing would not change anything, and something in me, the same instinct that had pulled me toward him earlier, told me that walking away now would only make things worse, not better. And he seemed to read that shift in me instantly, like he had been waiting for it, because the tension in the room eased just slightly, not disappearing, just adjusting, as if a piece had finally moved into place. "Good," he said quietly. And then he turned, already expecting me to follow again. And this time I did not hesitate, my steps falling into rhythm behind him as we moved down a different hallway, one that felt more private, less open. Like we were moving deeper into something rather than just through it. And the walls here were lined with clean, minimal design, nothing unnecessary, nothing distracting, everything intentional. And I realized that even the absence of detail here was a choice, a way to keep focus where it mattered, which, right now, was him and whatever he was about to show me. And we stopped in front of a door that looked no different from the others, but when it opened, the space inside shifted everything again. Screens lined one wall. Not flashy, not overwhelming. Just enough to tell me that this was where information lived, where things were watched, tracked, understood before they became visible to anyone else. And I hesitated in the doorway for a fraction of a second, the awareness hitting me that I was stepping into something I was never meant to see. But he did not pause. So I followed, the door closing softly behind us, sealing the moment in place. And he moved toward the center of the room, one of his men already there, waiting, like he had been here the entire time. Like nothing in this house ever truly stopped moving. "Show me," Alexander said, and the man nodded, tapping a screen that came to life instantly. And I tried not to look too closely at first, tried to stay grounded, but then I saw it, the restaurant, from an angle I had never noticed. The room captured in a way that made everything look smaller, more distant, like it was already becoming a memory instead of something I had just lived through. And my chest tightened as the footage played, not the explosion, not the aftermath, just the moments before, people talking, moving, existing like everything was normal, like nothing was about to change. And then I saw myself, moving through the space, tray in hand, blending into the background exactly the way I always had. And something about that version of me felt strange now, like I was looking at someone else entirely, someone who did not know what was coming. And then the moment shifted, and I saw him enter, the subtle change in the room even from that distance, and then me, stepping forward, reaching out, pulling him away, the exact second everything diverged from whatever had been planned. And I felt my breath catch as I watched it from the outside, because it looked so small, so quick, like nothing, and yet it had changed everything. And the screen paused on that moment, my hand on his sleeve. His body turning slightly, the guards reacting, the line between two different outcomes frozen in place. And I realized that this was what he meant. This was what he saw when he talked about change, about outcome, not emotion, not intention. Just the exact point where something shifted. "There," he said, his voice calm but focused. And I looked at him, then back at the screen, trying to understand what he was seeing that I was not. "That is where the plan failed," he continued. And I felt a chill run through me, Not from fear exactly, but from the clarity of it. The way he reduced everything to a single moment, a single action. And I swallowed, my voice quieter now. Because of me, I said. And he did not deny it, did not soften it, just nodded once, like it was already established. And I stared at the screen a second longer, at that frozen version of myself, realizing that the person in that frame had no idea what she was stepping into. No idea that one instinctive decision would pull her into a world where everything was watched, analyzed, and never forgotten. And when I finally looked away, I understood something I had been resisting until now. I was not just part of what happened, I was part of what came next. And in this room, in this world, that meant I was already being seen in ways I could not undo. Seeing it from that angle should have made it easier to understand, cleaner somehow, like watching it through a screen. It would separate me from it, turn it into something distant, something I could analyze the way he did. But it did the opposite. It pulled me closer, made it more real. Because I could see exactly how small the moment had been, how ordinary it looked, and yet how completely it had shifted everything. And I found myself staring at that paused frame longer than I meant to, my hand still on his sleeve, my expression focused but unaware, like I was reaching into something I could not see. And I felt something tighten in my chest at the thought that if I had hesitated, if I had ignored that feeling, the outcome would have been different in ways I did not fully understand but could no longer deny. Play it again, I said quietly, surprising myself as much as anyone else in the room, and Alexander glanced at me for a brief second before giving a small nod, the footage rewinding smoothly. The moment unfolding again, slower this time, more deliberate. And I forced myself to watch every detail, every movement, the way the room shifted when he entered, the way the man with the coat barely moved, the subtle tension I had felt without knowing why. And then there it was again, that second where everything aligned, where instinct took over before thought could interfere. And I felt it even now, watching it back, that same pull, that same certainty that something was about to break. And when the screen paused again, I exhaled slowly, not realizing I had been holding my breath. It was not just the sound, I said, more to myself than to him. And when I looked up, his attention sharpened immediately, like he had been waiting for that. Explain, he said, the same word as before. But this time it felt different, less like a command and more like an opening. And I took a second, trying to find the right way to describe something that did not have clear edges. It was everything. I said finally, my voice steadier now. The way that man held himself, the way no one else noticed him, the way the room felt off. And I hesitated, because saying it out loud made it sound vague, unreliable. But it was the truth, and then the sound made it real. I finished, and the room went quiet for a moment, not empty, but focused. Like every word had been placed somewhere specific, and Alexander did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting back to the screen, studying the same frame I had been staring at. But I could tell he was not just seeing the image, he was mapping it, connecting it to something larger, something beyond what I could see. You noticed the pattern before the trigger, he said after a moment, his voice calm but precise. And I frowned slightly at that. Not because I disagreed, but because I had not thought of it that way. I just felt it, I replied. And he looked at me again, that same intensity returning. But this time there was something else underneath it, something quieter, more deliberate. Feeling is often pattern recognition without language, he said. And I blinked slightly, caught off guard by the way he framed it. Because it made what I had done sound less like luck and more like something structured, something real. And I was not sure how I felt about that. So you think I can do it again? I asked, the question coming out before I had fully decided to ask it. And for the first time there was a pause that felt different, not uncertainty, but consideration, like the answer mattered in a way that went beyond this moment. I think you already did, he said quietly, and the words settled into the space between us with a weight that felt both grounding and unsettling at the same time. Because if that was true, if what I had done was not random, then it meant something about me had already changed. Or maybe it had always been there, and I had just never noticed. And I looked back at the screen one more time, at that frozen version of myself, realizing that I was no longer looking at someone separate from me. I was looking at the exact moment I crossed a line I could not step back over. And when I finally turned away, I felt something shift inside me again. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness. the kind that settles in quietly and does not leave. Because now it was not just about what had happened, it was about what I might be capable of seeing next, and whether I was ready for that or not. The room did not feel the same after that. Nothing in it had physically changed, but something inside me had, like a switch had been flipped, and now I could not unsee what I had just realized. And I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the frozen screen before finally stepping back, needing distance even if it was only a few feet. Because the version of me from earlier that night felt further away now than the city outside those walls, and Alexander watched that shift happen without interrupting it. His silence not empty but observant, like he was tracking not just what I said but how I moved, how I processed. And I realized he had probably done this before, not with me, but with situations where something unexpected became important, and the thought unsettled me more than anything else. "So what now?" I asked, turning back toward him, my voice steady but quieter, because the question carried more weight now than it had before. And he did not answer right away, his attention shifting briefly to one of the screens where something new had appeared, lines of information updating in real time. And even though I could not read it clearly, I could feel the change in the room, the subtle tightening that meant something was happening beyond what I could see. "Now we confirm what you interrupted," he said finally, his tone calm but more focused than before. And I frowned slightly, not because I disagreed, but because I did not fully understand what that meant. "You think there was more than one plan," I said, piecing it together as I spoke. And he looked at me again, that same sharp attention returning instantly, like he was measuring how quickly I could follow. "There is always more than one," he replied. And the certainty in his voice made it clear this was not speculation, it was experience. And I felt that realization settle in, because it meant the moment I had been fixated on, the one that felt so singular, so defining, was just one part of something larger, something still unfolding. "Then why show me this?" I asked, gesturing slightly toward the screen behind him, because if everything was still in motion, then focusing on the past seemed almost irrelevant. And for the first time there was the faintest shift in his expression that I could not quite place. Not surprise, not exactly, but recognition of the question itself. "Because you saw what my people did not," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "And that changes how I use the information in front of me." And I felt that word again, use, settle into the space between us. And I understood what he meant even if I did not like it. Because this was not just about understanding what had happened, it was about what could happen next, and whether I could see it before it did. "You want me to look for it again," I said, the realization forming as I spoke. And he did not deny it, which was answer enough. And I felt a mixture of resistance and something else I could not quite name rise in my chest, because part of me wanted to step back, to refuse, to remind him that I had not asked to be part of this, but another part, quieter but undeniable, wanted to know if I could do it again. If what I felt earlier was real, or just a coincidence I was giving too much meaning to. And I exhaled slowly, steadying myself before nodding once. "Then show me everything," I said, the words coming out more certain than I expected. And for the first time since I met him, there was a clear shift in his posture, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to tell me that something had just been decided. "Good," he said quietly. And then he moved, stepping closer to the screen, gesturing for the footage to change, and new angles appeared, different perspectives, the same space but from views I had not considered. And I forced myself to focus, to push past the noise in my head, the awareness of where I was, who I was standing next to, what this all meant. And instead look at what was in front of me, the patterns, the movement, the details that did not belong. And at first it all looked the same. Just people moving through a room, nothing out of place, nothing obvious. And I felt frustration start to creep in, because what if earlier had been luck? What if there was nothing to see now? Nothing to prove that I was anything more than someone who happened to react at the right time. And then I noticed it, not a sound this time, not something I could point to immediately, but a shift, subtle, almost invisible. The way one person's attention moved in a direction that did not match the rest of the room. The way another adjusted their position just slightly out of sync with everything else. And my breath slowed, my focus narrowing as that same feeling from earlier returned, quieter this time, but still there, still present. "Wait," I said. my voice low but firm enough to cut through the room, and Alexander did not interrupt, did not question, he just watched. And I leaned in slightly, my eyes tracking the movement I had just caught, the pattern beginning to form even if I could not fully explain it yet. "There is something else," I added. And as the words left my mouth, I realized this was no longer about proving anything to him. It was about proving something to myself. Because whatever I had stepped into, I was already part of it. And now I needed to understand just how far that went. The moment I said it, the room shifted again, not loudly or dramatically, but with an immediacy that made attention itself feel heavy, as if every eye in the room had settled on me at once. And I leaned closer to the screen without realizing how much space I had crossed, my focus narrowing until everything else faded into the background. The quiet hum of the room, the presence of the others, even him, all of it slipping away as I tracked the movement I had noticed. Replaying it in my head before I spoke again. "That man," I said, pointing slightly, careful but certain, "he is not reacting to what is happening. He is anticipating it." And I felt Alexander step closer beside me, not crowding, just aligning his view with mine, his silence sharper now, more engaged. And the footage slowed under his command, the subtle shift becoming clearer the longer I looked, the way the man adjusted his stance just before the room changed. The way his attention moved not toward the obvious, but toward something unseen, something expected. And my breath slowed as the pattern became more defined. "He knew something was about to happen," I added. And this time my voice did not waver. Because I could see it now, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to know I was not guessing. And the man operating the system glanced at Alexander, waiting. And he gave a slight nod, the footage rewinding again, isolating that moment, that person, until the rest of the room faded into secondary detail. And I felt something settle into place inside me, a quiet certainty that had not been there before, not like this, not this clear. And I straightened slightly, my arms no longer crossed, my stance less defensive without me realizing it. Because this was not just happening to me anymore. I was part of it, actively, intentionally. And Alexander's voice broke the silence, low and precise. "What else?" he said, not a question of doubt, but of expectation. And I forced myself to keep looking, to not stop at the first answer. Because I could feel it. There was more. There had to be more. And I shifted my attention outward, scanning the surrounding frames, the secondary movements, the small details that most people would miss. And at first it was nothing, just noise. Just people moving in ways that made sense. But then I caught it again, a second figure, further back, not connected directly, but not separate either, their timing slightly off. Their attention moving in the same direction as the first, but delayed, like they were part of the same pattern but not leading it. "There is another one," I said. Quieter this time, more focused. And I pointed again, the connection forming in my mind even as I spoke. They are not together, not visibly. But they are not independent either. And I paused, searching for the right way to explain something that was still forming. "It is like they are following the same signal." I finished, and the room went still in a different way this time, not just attentive, but responsive. Like something I had said had aligned with information they already had, and Alexander's expression did not change much. But I saw it in his eyes, the confirmation, the shift from observation to decision. And he stepped back slightly, giving a brief instruction to his man that I did not fully catch. Something about tracking, something about cross-referencing, and the screens changed again, pulling up different angles, different data. And I felt a strange mix of tension and clarity settle in my chest. Because this was no longer abstract, it was real, it was unfolding. And I was helping shape how it was understood. "You are seeing coordination," he said after a moment, his voice calm but more deliberate now, not chaos. And I nodded slowly. Because that was exactly what it felt like, not random, not disconnected, but structured in a way that only became visible if you knew where to look, or maybe if you felt it before you saw it. And I swallowed lightly, the realization settling deeper this time. "Which means this is not over," I said, more statement than question. And he looked at me, holding my gaze for a second longer than usual before responding. "It never was," he said quietly. And something about the way he said it made the room feel smaller, more focused, like everything outside of this moment had narrowed into a single path forward. And I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself, trying to hold on to the clarity I had just found. Because it felt important, not just for him, but for me, for understanding what I had stepped into and what I might be able to do next. And as the screens continued to shift, pulling in more information, more angles, more pieces of a pattern I was only beginning to see, I realized something that changed everything again. I was not just reacting anymore. I was anticipating, just like the man on the screen. Just like whatever had triggered this in the first place. And the thought should have unsettled me. But instead it did something else entirely. It made me focus even more. Because if I could see it once, if I could feel it twice, then maybe this was not an accident at all. Maybe this was something I had always been capable of. And now that it was awake, there was no way to ignore it. Only a choice about how far I was willing to follow it. The room did not slow down after that realization. It sharpened, like every second mattered more now that we knew there was something still moving beneath the surface. And I could feel it in the way the screens updated faster, the way the people around us stopped watching passively and started acting with intention, pulling data, isolating movements, connecting threads that had been invisible just minutes ago. And I stayed where I was, not stepping back this time, not trying to create distance, because there was no point anymore. I was already in it, already part of whatever this was becoming. And Alexander moved differently now, not just observing but directing, his presence shifting the entire room without him raising his voice. A few words here, a small gesture there, and everything adjusted around him like it had been waiting for that exact input. And I realized that control here was not loud, it was precise. And that somehow made it more absolute. Expand the perimeter window by 15 minutes, he said to one of his men, his tone calm but firm. And I watched as the footage shifted again, pulling in moments from before I had even noticed anything. Earlier arrivals, different angles, the build-up to something I had only seen the end of. And I leaned in slightly, my focus locking back onto the screen, because if there had been a pattern before, there would be one here too. I just had to find it. And for a moment it felt overwhelming, too much movement, too many faces, too many possibilities. And I almost missed it, the smallest detail, a pause that did not belong, a hesitation in someone's step that did not match the flow of the room. And my breath caught again, that same feeling rising, quieter but sharper this time, like it had learned from before. There, I said, my voice cutting through the low hum of activity without me meaning it to, and Alexander's attention shifted instantly, his gaze following mine without question, without delay. And the footage slowed under his command, isolating the moment I had pointed out. And I watched it again, more carefully this time, the way the person adjusted their path just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to change where they ended up, where they were standing when everything else happened. And I felt it click into place, not fully, not completely, but enough to understand that this was not random, not even close. They were positioning, I said. The words forming as the pattern became clearer, not reacting, not just waiting, placing themselves. And I glanced at Alexander briefly, then back to the screen. Because saying it out loud made it more real, more defined. And I could feel the shift in the room again. The way my observation changed how everything was being processed, how the pieces were being arranged. And it was not lost on me that I was the one driving that shift now, not by authority, not by command, but by seeing something others had not. And that realization settled deep, heavier than anything before it. Because it meant this was not temporary, not something I could step away from when it was over. If they were positioning, then they expected something to happen after. I continued, my voice steadier now, more certain, and Alexander nodded once. A small motion, but enough to confirm that I was not off track. Which means tonight was not the end of anything. I added. And he stepped closer to the screen, his attention narrowing, his focus aligning with mine in a way that felt intentional, like we were working in the same direction now, not separately. And I felt a strange sense of alignment at that, unexpected but undeniable. Find their entry points, he said to his team, and the screens shifted again. Pulling up new data, new angles, tracing the paths of the people I had identified. And I watched as the lines connected, as their movements before and after the moment I had focused on began to form something larger, something structured. And I felt my chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the realization of how much I was starting to see, how quickly it was becoming clear once I knew where to look. And I glanced at Alexander again, just for a second. And this time his expression was different, not distant, not purely analytical, but something more focused, more certain, like he had already reached a conclusion I was only beginning to understand. They are not just connected, he said quietly, his voice low but carrying through the room. They are part of something ongoing, and I swallowed lightly, the weight of that settling in, because ongoing meant this was not contained, not finished, not something that would fade away once the night ended. It meant it would continue, move, adapt. And I was already in the middle of it, whether I wanted to be or not. And I looked back at the screen, at the paths, the patterns, the subtle shifts that had gone unnoticed by everyone else. And I realized something that made everything feel different again. This was not just about what I had done. It was about what I could do now. What I was already doing, seeing, connecting, understanding in a way I had never considered before. And as that thought settled in, I knew there was no going back to who I had been before this night. Because that version of me would not have seen any of this, would not have understood it. And now that I did, now that I could, the only question left was how far this would go, and whether I was ready for the answer. The more the pieces connected, the quieter the room seemed to become. Not because activity had stopped, but because everything was now moving with purpose, with direction. And I stood there watching it unfold, realizing that what had started as a single moment, a single instinct, had expanded into something far more structured than I could have imagined. And I could feel it in the way my mind worked now, faster, sharper, like it had adjusted to match the pace of everything around me. And for the first time since I walked into this house, I was not just trying to keep up, I was beginning to anticipate. And that realization settled into me with a strange mix of clarity and unease. Because it meant this was not temporary, not something that would fade once the night ended. It was something that had already changed how I saw the world. And I was not sure I could undo that even if I tried. Focus on their exit paths, Alexander said, his voice cutting through my thoughts with quiet precision. And I turned back to the screen immediately, my attention locking onto the shifting data as new lines appeared, tracing movement beyond the moment we had been analyzing, following the individuals I had identified as they left the scene. And I leaned slightly closer, my eyes tracking the paths, noticing how they diverged, how they did not leave together, did not even acknowledge each other. And yet there was a rhythm to it, a spacing that felt intentional, like they were following separate routes that still led to the same place. They are not just coordinating inside, I said slowly, piecing it together as I watched. They are dispersing in a pattern, and Alexander nodded once, his gaze never leaving the screen, controlled separation. He added, and the way he said it made it sound like something familiar, something practiced. And I felt another layer of understanding settle in. Because this was not a one-time event, this was a system, a method, something designed to work repeatedly without drawing attention. And I swallowed lightly, the weight of that realization pressing in, because if it was a system, then it had been used before. And it would be used again. Which means we are not looking at the beginning, I said, my voice quieter now, more certain. We are looking at something already in motion. And this time when I glanced at him, there was no hesitation in his response, just a steady confirmation. Yes, he said. And that single word carried more weight than anything else. Because it confirmed what I had been starting to understand, that tonight was not an isolated event. It was part of something larger, something that had been unfolding long before I noticed it. And I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself as I looked back at the screen, because now the question was not just what had happened, but what was going to happen next, and whether we could see it before it did. If they are following a system, then there will be consistency, I said. Thinking out loud now, no longer holding back the way I had before, because there was no point. I was already part of this, already contributing. Patterns repeat, even when they are designed not to be obvious. And Alexander turned slightly toward me at that, his attention shifting just enough to acknowledge what I had said. Find the repetition, he said, not as a command, but as a directive, something we were both now working toward. And the difference mattered more than I wanted to admit. Because somewhere between the blast in the kitchen and this room full of screens, he had stopped treating me like collateral and started looking at me like something he was unwilling to lose. And I nodded, my focus sharpening again as I scanned the data, looking for alignment, for moments where movement mirrored itself across different times, different angles. And it took a second, longer than before, but then I saw it. Not identical, not exact, but close enough to matter. A sequence of movement that echoed across the footage, subtle shifts in positioning, timing that aligned just enough to suggest intention rather than coincidence. And my breath caught slightly as I pointed it out, explaining what I was seeing as clearly as I could, and the room responded immediately, the system adjusting, highlighting the connections, confirming what I had felt before I fully understood it. And I felt something settle into place inside me again, stronger this time, more defined. Because this was no longer just instinct, it was recognition, it was understanding. And I realized that the more I engaged with it, the clearer it became, like a language I had never learned but somehow already knew how to speak. It is consistent, I said, more firmly now. Not obvious, but consistent enough to track. And Alexander watched the screen for a moment longer before nodding. His expression calm but focused. Then we follow it, he said. And there was something in the way he said it that made everything feel more real, more immediate. Because following it meant this was not staying here. It was moving forward, expanding beyond this room, beyond this night. And I felt a quiet shift inside me at that. Something that felt like acceptance, not of the situation itself, but of my place in it. Because whether I had chosen this or not, I was already part of it, already seeing what others did not, already helping to uncover something that was still unfolding. And as I stood there, watching the patterns come into focus, I realized that whatever came next, whatever this led to, I was not going to be able to look away anymore. Not after seeing it this clearly, not after understanding how it worked, because once you see the pattern, you cannot pretend it is not there. And now that I had, there was only one direction left to go. The direction became clear the moment he said it, not just in the room, not just on the screens, but inside me, like everything that had felt uncertain before had finally aligned into something I could not ignore. And I stood there watching the patterns continue to unfold, the lines connecting across time, across movement, across intention. And for the first time since this all began, I was not trying to understand what had happened. I was trying to see what would happen next. And that shift changed everything. Because it meant I was no longer looking backward. I was looking forward, anticipating, the same way they had been, the same way the system had been designed to operate. And I felt that realization settle into me with a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken. If it repeats, then it will appear again, I said. My voice steady, my focus still locked on the screen, and Alexander did not respond immediately. But I could feel his attention sharpen, aligning with mine in a way that felt almost instinctive now. Yes, he said finally. And there was something in that single word that felt different, less like confirmation and more like agreement, like we were no longer approaching this from separate perspectives, but from the same one. And I swallowed lightly, my eyes scanning the data again, searching for the next point where the pattern might surface, where the structure might reveal itself again. And it took a moment, longer than before, but then I saw it, not in the footage from the restaurant, but in the extended data. Something that mirrored the sequence we had identified, subtle, almost hidden, but consistent enough to matter. And my breath caught as I leaned closer, pointing it out before I even fully formed the words. There, I said, my voice low but certain. And the system responded instantly, isolating the sequence, expanding it, revealing the connections that had been buried just beneath the surface. And I felt that same clarity rise again, stronger this time, more defined, because now it was not just one instance, it was repetition, confirmation. Proof that what I had seen was real. It is happening again, I added, and Alexander stepped closer, his gaze locking onto the same point, his presence steady, controlled. But there was something else there now, something sharper, more focused, like the pieces had aligned for him as well. Where? He asked. And I traced the sequence with my eyes, following the pattern as it extended beyond the immediate data, connecting to something larger, something that moved beyond this house, beyond this moment. And I felt a chill run through me, not from fear, but from the realization of how far this reached. Not here, I said quietly, my voice tightening just slightly. Somewhere else. And the room shifted again, the screens updating, new information being pulled in, the system expanding outward to follow the path I had just identified. And I stepped back slightly, not out of hesitation, but because I could feel the scale of it now, the way this was no longer contained. No longer something that could be resolved within these walls. And Alexander turned toward his team, his voice calm, but carrying a new weight. "Prepare to move," he said. And those 3 words changed everything. Because they meant this was no longer observation, it was action, it was forward movement. And I felt my chest tighten at that, the reality of it settling in fully for the first time. Because moving meant leaving this space, stepping into whatever came next, into whatever this pattern was leading us toward. And I glanced at him, just for a second. And this time there was no distance in his expression, no separation between what he saw and what I had shown him, just a shared focus, a shared direction. And something warmer beneath it, something protective that unsettled me more than the danger did. Because for the first time that night, I understood he was not only moving to stop whoever came for him, he was moving with me in mind too. And I realized something in that moment that I could not ignore. I was not just part of this anymore. I was necessary to it. And the thought should have unsettled me, should have made me step back, but instead it did something else entirely. It grounded me, because if I was already in it, if I was already seeing what others could not, then stepping forward was not a choice. It was the only way this could go. And as the room moved around us, as the plan shifted from analysis to action, I took a breath and steadied myself, my focus sharpening once more. Because whatever was coming next, whatever waited at the end of this pattern, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would see it before it happened. And this time, I would not hesitate.